the Imperial War Museum in South London, once the site of Bedlam, the famous mental asylum, and now appropriately perhaps, a memorial to the glory and folly of war. Hello and welcome to Afternoon Plus. Tomorrow the World Disarmament Campaign will be holding a national convention at the Central Hall, Westminster, just a mile or so away from here. So against a background of real concern for world safety, we're at the Imperial War Museum today to discuss war and peace.
World events have become more complicated. On the one hand, the threat of nuclear war haunts us all. On the other, the spread of worldwide communications has meant that we've become more aware of other countries, other policies, other beliefs, other ways of life.
With me now in the boardroom of the Imperial War Museum is Michael Howard, Professor of War at Oxford. After that afternoon programme that we did with Winston Churchill about conscription, we were surprised because 2/3 of the people who called us to give us their views said they were for conscription. Now, do you think that the present state of affairs warrants that response?
I think it warrants a much greater degree of awareness that the world is a very dangerous place than has been general up till recently. If people feel that the best way in which they can make that awareness felt is by calling for national service, then I am pleased about this. I myself doubt whether national service really is the answer. I don't think that the kind of armed forces that we need today are armed forces calling on the whole of the population as in the last two world wars. If it does mean that people are prepared to think seriously about the problems of defense, do what is necessary if a conflict were to arise, and to put themselves at the disposal of the local community, then this, I think, is a good sign. But I think it is an appalling situation when this does become necessary.
Would you sketch in for me, as a historian, the main causes of the wars in the past?
Well, there's been an awful lot of the past, and there have been a lot of wars, and they've been fought for many different reasons. They're usually broken down in three headings. Wars for fear, people fighting one another because they're afraid of one another and afraid that they're going to get overrun. Wars for economic resources, wars for trade, wars for raw materials. And finally, wars for doctrine, ideology, religion, whatever you like to put it, differing ideas about the way in which the world ought to be organized and what people ought to believe. But quite often these are rationalizations. For a very long period, people thought that war in itself was a splendid and honorable thing, and that fighting was natural, and that war was natural and peace was rather unnatural. And if you look back over 2,000 years of past history of certainly the Western world, most of our societies have thought that way until 100 years ago or so.
Well, in a grotesque sort of a way, that war is necessary.
Everybody at some time has thought that some wars have been necessary.
The one question I've got to put to you, which actually makes me feel quite ill when I say it, is this one. If World War broke out today, would it be for the same reasons as it has in the past, say for the 1939 war?
It depends why it broke out, but certainly all those causes are present. There are mutual fears. There is particularly the fear on the part of the West that our access to essential raw materials may be cut off by people who are hostile to us. And above all, there are ideological differences and rivalries of an even more intense kind in the world now than has been usual in the past. So yes, all these causes are still present.
What are the more intense reasons?
More intense reasons? Well, we have the world divided into two parts. A Marxist group who have a very clear-cut philosophy about the way in which they feel that the world should be organized, and a pluralist society, which has almost equally, since deeply felt, if less clear, views about it. And much more important than either of those, we have developing within what is called the third world, groups who are conscious of what they regard as the injustice of the world in which as it's organized, their inability to express themselves, their oppression, and their determination to do something about it, if necessary, by violence. And I think that there are more people around now who regard violence as a legitimate instrument of policy than perhaps there have been at any time in the past 200 years.
For your sins, you say to me, you have studied war for the last 25 years. What's your personal attitude to it?
Well, since for 3 years I was involved in it, I dislike it intensely. Being the member of a fairly comfortable society in a job I like, well paid, wanting the world to go on much as it is at the moment, I would hate a war to happen. But I am well aware that there are many people in the world who are bitterly resentful of the way in which the world is organized, feel it to be a savagely unjust world, and would regard a war to make it a more just world as being perfectly legitimate. Where you stand depends on where you sit.
Well, Mavis, Michael Howard and I have been joined for part 2 by General Tony Younger, who's just retired from NATO, and Elizabeth Sigmund, author and pacifist. Elizabeth, if I can start with you, as a pacifist, is there no war you'd fight?
I'm rather thrown by being described as a pacifist because I think I'm a fighter. I think
Fighting pacifist.
Yes, I think it's a very genuine position now because I think one has to regard war in the terms of reference that we see it at the moment. And I think that war has become unfightable, unwinnable. If Lord Mountbatten can say this, I think I must be at least partly right. I think one has to fight very hard with one's intelligence now, with one's whole integrity. I think it's the hardest battle mankind will ever fight and has ever had to fight, to say the time has come to control the aggressive impulses and the fears of mankind in order to prevent our world being destroyed, because that is exactly the choice before us.
For all that integrity, though, isn't it a frustrating position? Because in the end, the man with a gun will always destroy the man without it.
Well, I don't agree with your premise. I think that there are many instances of thought overcoming the sword, that the word is mightier than the sword in many instances. I also think that we're not talking about men with guns. I think there is still perhaps a feeling around that we can fight the last war or the war before the last, or even still the medieval wars, that it is a man against a man. It isn't this anymore. The remote controlled nuclear warhead or nerve gas warhead means that you are killing people you will never see, never have seen, and of whom you know nothing. This is the most frightening, that it has become, will be a robot war of machines against the most vulnerable among us. And I think when you reach this point, that mankind has to say, this is enough.
Do you think that the voice of peace is being heard more? It seems to be in the media.
I don't know. This is what we have to wait and see. I think there are a lot of people. Michael Howard said that he felt there was a lot of violence about now, a great feeling that violence was acceptable. I think there's also a great feeling among the very young, and certainly among women, that violence is not acceptable, that it is something that has to be fought. A great feeling of fear.
General Younger, you've spent a lot of time in your life actually fighting wars.
Sometimes, I think.
And you're now going around lecturing, in fact, about the possibility of a nuclear war. Do you think that there are, amongst people, a feeling that there is some redeeming features in war, that sometimes even people at the moment are saying, we need a war to pull us together? I mean, I get quite astonished by it, but I was reminded by J.B. Priestley the other day on a piece of film saying the British were absolutely at their best in the Second World War. They were never as good, certainly in my lifetime before it, and I'm sorry to say that they've never been quite as good after it. In a way, I find that a very dangerous emotion and quite opposite to Elizabeth's.
There must be some truth in it. The Dunkirk spirit has been talked about often enough, and there's no doubt there was in the country at that time a tremendous will to do what was required by the country, a will which is not apparent today. But this doesn't mean to say that I would advocate starting a war in order to get that back again, because the dangers of the next World War, and here I presume we are talking about a world war, not some more minor war, but the dangers of a world war are very great. I believe that if there is a war in Europe, it's going to be nuclear. And this is a terrible danger.
But I mean, the very thought of a nuclear war kind of almost blanks me out. I mean, I just find it so horrific that I can't actually see how there can be one without there being such devastation, that it's not like any other war's ever been.
You've put it correctly. I mean, man has the ability now to wipe out civilizations, whereas in earlier times, I'm sure that Michael Howard would agree, man could wipe out man or wipe out men, or groups of men, but not complete civilizations. Now we have weapons that are big enough to eliminate in a flash a great city like this. And therefore the scale of danger is quite different. It's a different order of magnitude to anything we've ever known before.
But what are we doing about that scale of danger, then, if anything?
What are we doing about it? Well, we're trying to deter it from ever happening, and that's what our armed forces are about today, to try and deter a war ever starting. But I'd like to just go back to the fact that I reckon that the war, if there is one in Europe, will be nuclear. The reason I say that is that it is an announced policy by NATO that if NATO risks being defeated, NATO will go nuclear. Now, if you look at it from the other point of view, if the Soviet Union risked not achieving whatever its objectives were, I suspect that the Soviet Union would have to go nuclear. So you get the situation that if NATO is too weak, NATO has to go nuclear. If NATO is too strong, I fear the Soviet Union has to go nuclear. And this is the danger that I fear, and therefore that the chances of having a full-scale nuclear war in Europe are, I'm afraid, very high. It doesn't mean to say they're inevitable, but they're high.
Could I come in and point to the paradox which has now arrived? Because the situation, as Elizabeth has pointed out, is that a war now is that is to say, a war between great industrial states is likely to mean the end of those great industrial states in an unimaginable fashion. So long as this consciousness is there and is generally shared, the general will to avoid war is very, very strong indeed. If there was not this feeling, if people felt that it was going to be possible to fight with, quote, civilized, unquote, weapons, the deterrent against war wouldn't be nearly so great. I mean, the appalling weapons which have been described, these nerve gases, these chemical apparatuses, apart from nuclear war, impose terror in the minds of everybody, and that is good. But conventional war was horrible enough. And the idea that one should, as it were, sanitize war, make it safe to fight, get away from all these horrible weapons and get back to nice, simple weapons which we can fight a gentlemanly war with, seems to me to make absolutely no sense whatever.
Well, I would agree with this very much. I also think that, though I find the cynicism of a government who says we cannot afford civil defense for our people, we can defend our troops against various forms of attack, but our people know they're expendable, which is in fact what the Home Office told me the other week. I find that quite obscene. On the other hand, to say that we can pretend by hiding under our kitchen tables with piles of books that we can survive a nuclear holocaust, I think is just as obscene. I think the people, we are still a democracy. I think the people have to be aware, fully aware, of the weapons that come under the heading of conventional, because nerve gas is now under the heading of a conventional weapon. And none of us will be protected against such things. The people also are still in control in a democracy. They have the right to say, we demand that there is a full debate on our defense posture, on civil defense. I don't see that this has happened. And as I was told at the Home Office the other week, the people don't particularly care about civil defense, so how can we expect a bigger budget?
Yes, you were saying you were for civil defense, General Younger.
I divide this problem up into two parts, the short term and the long term. And I find this is now talking about the short-term answer. The short-term answer is we have to try and deter this war in order that, whilst both camps are well armed, that the other camp does not care to attack us because he thinks it's going to hurt too much. Now, in that scenario, if you can use that word, civil defense has a part to play, because underneath a nuclear burst, there's going to be no survivors, but there will be rings of destruction getting less and less as you go further from the burst. And if you have no civil defense, people will be killed further out than if you have civil defense. So from that point of view, civil defense will permit probably hundreds of thousands of people to survive if you've got it, that otherwise would be killed.
But there's a letter today which I've just been handed, that there is no civil defense against H-bombs. The only defense is to stop war breaking out, and that by talking about this very thing, you are conditioning people's minds to accept that nuclear war is a possibility, as long as we have got plenty of civil defense. That's what horrifies me about this. I was under the impression that there's no hope.
Could I come in on this?
Yes.
Because that seems to me to be bad logic. The idea that war will not happen if we don't think about it doesn't really seem to me to carry a great deal of conviction. Wars happen for a whole varied lot of reasons. And it's interesting that the countries which take their civil defense most seriously are the professional neutral countries, Sweden and Switzerland, countries which are not going to start a war but realize that if a war occurs, they themselves may be caught up in it. Civil defense seems to me to be the kind of precaution that one takes when one installs seat belts in one's car and belts up. If you get involved in a really major smash, then of course they're not going to help. If you get involved in a minor accident, they could well save lives. And to provide oneself with seat belts does not mean to say that one approves of motor accidents.
What I'd like to know now, though, is whether or not public opinion has changed so much that we've all been talking about this catastrophic war that may or may not occur. But what about public opinion? Presumably there are going to be people at home now who are going to say, no, I won't fight. I don't think that this war is necessary. And since Vietnam, I think there's a growing tide of public opinion who will not fight. Michael, do you feel that?
Well, I think that is true, and the same was the case in the 1930s. There was the overwhelming amount of public opinion in Britain in the 1930s said, we will never fight again. Or let the old men fight, the young won't. And as a result, Munich occurred, appeasement occurred, and war became not less probable, it became a great deal more probable, until eventually it became certain. So I don't deny that that may be the state of mind of public opinion. What I do deny is that it is going to make war any less likely.
How important is the public opinion, though?
In a democracy, it is all important.
So President Carter and Margaret Thatcher are going to have to really think hard before they go to this sort of length.
In the same way as Chamberlain had to think very hard and did.
Right, well, if public opinion is to be noted, and it always will be, as you're suggesting, what about the world disarmament that's going to happen tomorrow? I mean, will that have an influence? You believe it will, Elizabeth, because you're going to speak at it.
I believe it must. I think that, I'm afraid when Michael says that public opinion has very great effect, I feel he's a little sanguine. I think that, particularly in my book about chemical and biological weapons, the public haven't known a lot of what has been going on. The preparations for war or defense, whichever you choose to call it, have gone on. The decisions to continue to start this sort of research into these things were taken behind closed doors. Nobody can tell me what democratic process went on. Certainly a lot of the moves that were made, which contravened the Geneva Protocol, were certainly not taken in the House of Commons. They were not debated by our MPs. So I think it's perhaps a little sanguine to say that without us striving too hard, we shall be given a voice. I think that my husband's family are Czechoslovakian, and they have said to me many times, you have a democracy still. You have to keep it alive. A democracy is like a muscle. If you don't use it, it dies. And I think we have a very hard struggle on our hands to make our democracy live and work, and I think this is one way in which we can do it. that the feelings of the people have got to be heard, they have got to be accepted, and they've got to be debated on a very serious level. I think women have a very strong responsibility now because, again, Michael said, in fact, I think both of you said, war was accepted by people. Now, how many women do they actually include in the acceptance of the First World War? I know there were women who handed out white feathers, but how many women watched their sons and their husbands die? And did they feel, really, that that they were being asked whether they wanted this war to happen? Have women ever actually been involved in the decision-making process? Now, I think that we have an absolute duty to say, this world will be destroyed as we know it. Democracy, which is what we would be supposed to be going to war to preserve, would be totally destroyed. We would only survive in a totalitarian state after an atomic war. It's the only state that could survive in any way. We would be destroying democracy by the very war we would undertake in order to preserve democracy. And we have to say so.
But do you think then disarmament is one way to peace? Because if we disarm, then we are going to lose our values, aren't we, and our sense of liberty if others do not disarm.
I think that's a risk you have to take. The opposite is certain destruction. And I would rather take the risk.
And what about the emerging nations, Elizabeth, too? Here in the papers a few weeks ago that Iraq is now likely to have the nuclear bomb. Iran has it. Various other countries, India, Pakistan, are rumored to have it. What about those countries that are emerging and maybe people with less benevolence than we have start using them?
I think that the Branch report has a lot to say upon this because both the other speakers have emphasised the fact that war doesn't just happen, though there was a suggestion it might just happen because men were aggressive. I think that's perhaps nowadays is a little facile. I think war happens because of fear, because of inequality, because of economic pressures. I think the Branch report says we live in one world. That world has to include the poorest countries. We have to share what we have. We have to think very hard about our citizenship of the globe, and that only we now can decide whether that globe is going to, in fact, survive. And I think we have to think about these potential aggressors in a very careful and complete way, not break them off as if they were the creatures that we must fear, and therefore we put them on the other side of an iron curtain.
Tony Younger, do you feel that this opinion that Elizabeth is expressing, you find being expressed by more people?
Yes, absolutely. But I think this is a very important question you ask about disarmament.
Yes.
Personally, I wish that I felt that disarmament would provide an answer. The reason I don't is that, as I was saying earlier, before this started, if you have a man in front of you with a spear, the reason, or what's going to happen, depends on what's in his mind. Now, if someone disarms him and gives him a plowshare instead of a spear, he'll kill you with a plowshare, if that's what's in his mind. So what has to be done is, it's a mental maturity that is required. And disarmament, I think, aims at the wrong thing. It aims at taking the spear away, which I don't think he's ever going to do, particularly if you've got one. And there's all the question of seeing whether anybody's cheating on this that comes up.
Everyone talks of the morality of war. Michael, you've researched it for so many years. I mean, I don't believe there is a morality in war, is there?
Look, may I go back to the question of disarmament, because I haven't come in on that one. I don't agree with Elizabeth about the First World War, because I think that at that time, public opinion genuinely was belligerent. I'm afraid that even women were belligerent, horribly belligerent, both in England and in Germany. These were bellicose societies. And the wars were, to some extent, in response to public opinion. In the Second World War, British public opinion was very, very pacific indeed. Unfortunately, the public opinion in the ruling circles in Germany was not pacific. And if you have a peaceful public opinion in one country and a rather bellicose one in another, you're not going to get peace. You're going to get a rather disagreeable kind of war in which one side is fighting with one hand behind its back. The problem is to get public opinion in every country equally concerned, which means the circulation of information. It means the demolition of totalitarian societies. so long as you have some societies which totally control their own public opinions, then you do have a very, very unbalanced world. And this is what worries me a little, that if in the West we were to get public opinion thoroughly sensible, thoroughly civilized, thoroughly educated, saying under no circumstances will we fight, then I think that they might find that their own societies become gradually overborne by societies which are prepared to fight.
So are you saying that war is inevitable?
No, war is never inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, except death.
Tony Younger was saying that he wanted people to be prepared in their minds about war, against war. That's what you said.
Yes, what I would say about this is I think conflict is inevitable, which isn't saying that war is inevitable. And that's what I feel about it. And I quite agree with what Michael Howard's been saying. But surely just as we have, I don't know, I'd like to put this to Michael Howard, on a level of society in this country, we have got to a stage where we don't, if we have an argument, go out and kill each other. Now, if we can, whereas presumably when we were cavemen, we probably did. Now, if we can do that within a society, is it too much to hope that the heads of our society, namely the leaders, can not get to the same level of maturity in dealing with our conflicts?
What do you mean, at a point where they'll bargain with each other rather than go to war?
Well, this happens, after all, most of the time, and wars only happen at final moments when the conflicts which go on the whole time suddenly appear for various reasons unresolvable. The problem is, now it seems to me, not conflicts between great societies, because the horrible danger of that is so obvious to everybody that they will act with very great discretion. The problems are at a much lower level within societies, in third world areas where there are no legitimate states as yet, when people feel they are being unjustly treated, and I'm afraid will continue to be for some time, whatever happens about the Brunch report, and where the situation appears so unjust that young men are prepared to take up arms rather than to exist with it for a single moment longer.
Do you think young men are, at the moment, in this country, prepared to take up arms, Tony? Do you think, because Mrs. Thatcher made a pretty hard line and followed Carter when the Afghanistan invasion occurred, do you think that she reflects the mood of the country?
I couldn't say, but I mean, I would say that there is still quite a strong sense of duty, I think, in this country. So from that point of view, I'm sure that a number would feel, if their country was threatened, that the thing they must do is to take up arms.
Despite the fact that it could well turn out to be, as you say, a nuclear war.
Yes, but you see, if the object is to deter the war, if they're taking up the arms in order to deter it, this then is rather different than to take it up for some belligerent reason, such as Michael Howard was saying, in order to attack Poland or something, which it wouldn't be.
Because this time, it's not just the men who are going to be involved, is it? It's the women,
civilians,
women and children at home, and the men will be away when the women and children are going to be, for the first time, bombed in a big way.
Yes, that's why I feel that there has to be two approaches to this. One is the short term, when both sides are so well armed that the only way to stop it, I would think, is to be so well armed yourself that the other chap thinks twice. But in the long term, that isn't good enough. You've got to have something a bit more sure, because it's so dangerous, this knife edge, peace balancing on a knife edge, which is getting sharper and sharper. It's too dangerous. You've got to have something a bit more.
Well, what's the bit more, though? What's the bit more? Not to alarm us too much.
Well, this is the bit more is to get to a moral attitude between the powers that is sufficiently civilized so that they can decide to solve their conflicts without blowing each other up.
Perhaps our duty should be not to our own country, but to our own world.
Yes.
You see, what confuses me about all this is that we're talking about logical people, but not all governments are logical, are they? Particularly, what should we say, in the emerging countries, we're in more danger there, are we not, Michael?
I think there will always be a rogue amongst the society, whatever level the society is. There will always be a rogue, and if we do adopt some form of mature government, if you like, there's got to be some means of keeping the rogue down.
What about nationalism, Michael? Do you think this is a major danger?
I think that nationalism means a sense of one's own identity which is normally being oppressed by other people. And there's a great deal of this feeling, I'm afraid, in the world as a whole now. We have more or less grown out of it. Well, I was going to say we've more or less grown out of it in Europe, but we haven't, because now the sort of submerging nationalisms have arisen. And this is what I meant when I said there are still many groups around who feel that the world is unjust because their particular group is being oppressed.
And people like Camilla Torres, who said in a book I was reading at the weekend, all sincere revolutionaries must realize that arms struggle is the only remaining way open. You're not going to change people's minds about that, are you? People will burn houses in Wales for their nationalism. There's Ireland, there's South Africa, Israel. I mean, nationalist wars are wars that one seems to expect to happen. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but isn't that so?
Well, shall I say, these are wars which seem to people who are fighting them to be profoundly just.
Just, that's right.
My hope is just... Sorry.
You notice the burning of a house in Wales. You notice the dramatic event which proves nationalism. You don't see the people who beaver away quietly in the background, who love their country and who believe in a peaceful world, but they are working away.
Tony Young, I'd like to ask you if there's a way that we can end this program. I'm going to ask all three of you, actually. What would be the positive attitude we should adopt to avoid a war? A really serious war, I mean...
Yes. Well, again, I have to divide my answer into two bits, short-term and long-term. The short-term, I think we must be as strong as we can in order to deter the other side from attacking. But in the long-term, somehow we've got to work to a more mature attitude. And I would think that the only way of doing this is to build as many bridges over the Iron Curtain as possible so that it eventually becomes as irrelevant as Hadrian's Wall, as a barrier. And I mean, I would like to see dentists talking to dentists on the other side, and you know, as much movement and contact over the Iron Curtain as possible in order that both sides realize the plain truth, which is that neither side really wants a war, and they're both just ordinary people trying to do ordinary lives.
Can I ask you, Elizabeth, the same thing? What's the positive attitude that we should have?
I think the word that you used several times, Tony, maturity. I think also the word communication is very important. I don't think that one can regard Russia, or whoever one is regarding as the enemy, as totally closed. There are means of communication. I think they must be kept open and developed. But I think a world maturity is what we have to reach, and it's going to be very hard. But I think that is the battle we now have to fight.
Michael Howard.
I agree with everything that's been said. And the first thing is, don't panic. Keep calm, judge coolly, appreciate the intentions of everybody, not in a black and white way, but realize their own problems. And they have got problems. But at the same time, make it quite clear to them that we have problems too, and that there are areas which are very, very sensitive as far as we are concerned, such as, if you like, our access to oil. And it would be very unwise to push too hard on these sensitive nerves, because we might then panic.
It's interesting that governments want to be secret, and we're all saying we shouldn't be. So you're saying that there should be no secrets.
I was not saying anything of the kind.
I was hoping you were going to say that, because that's one of my pet things.
I know, but you're putting words into my mouth.
Well, we'd like to thank the Imperial War Museum for permission to come here today. They told us that they wanted us to say that the views expressed on this program were not necessarily theirs. Who said it. And I'd like also to say from all of us here, a very good afternoon to you.